Good afternoon. Today I will be talking about Case Study 1, Restless Leg Syndrome, for American Public University, Principles of Genetics with Professor Dr. King, and it is January 30th, 2022. So this case study involves 9 people. 1 in 20 people suffer from restless leg syndrome, and first we're going to talk about the couple, Suzanne and Michael. They have red hair and pale skin, and they have no family history of restless leg syndrome. They eventually have 2 identical twin boys, Marvin and Gary, who also have red hair and cannot tan. So Jackie and David are another couple we will talk about. They have dark brown hair, and David suffers from restless leg syndrome, and they have a daughter, Eileen, who has dark brown hair and does not suffer from restless leg syndrome. So Gary, one of the identical twin boys, marries Eileen, and they have a son named Todd, who does not tan, has red hair, and suffers from restless leg syndrome. Personal interests. This case really stuck out to me because I know multiple people with restless leg syndrome, and I think I even suffer from it a little bit. I get this uncontrollable urge to move my legs in the middle of the night, from this uneasy feeling in your legs, and it could be multiple different feelings that we will talk about later in this. I also had no idea that this restless leg syndrome could be inherited. Next, we have worksheet questions, and to better understand these questions, it's easy to assign dominant and recessive alleles or traits to each of these individuals for restless leg syndrome and red melanin. So normal legs are represented by the dominant allele N, and restless leg syndrome is represented by the recessive allele N. And the best way to tell between dominant and allele, dominant will always have a uppercase letter, and recessive will always have a lowercase letter. So dark brown hair will be represented by the dominant trait B, and red hair will be represented by the recessive trait B. Question 1. Which individuals must be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome? So we know that Michael and Suzanne have red hair and they cannot tan, and they don't have restless leg syndrome. Therefore, Suzanne has the traits of dominant normal legs and recessive for red hair, and Michael has the traits of normal legs and red hair. They have the twins Gary and Marvin, who have the traits of normal legs and red hair. So does Gary. They are identical, so they'll have the same traits. Jackie has the traits of normal legs and brown hair, dark brown hair, both dominant traits for those. And she does, it is messed up here a little bit. There should not be multiple of these. So she will have the recessive allele for red hair and normal legs also. David has the trait of recessive red hair or red melanin, and Eileen has a trait of normal legs and dark brown hair, both dominant traits for those. Gary and Eileen's son Todd has the traits of red hair and restless leg syndrome. So in simpler terms, Suzanne and Michael do not have restless leg syndrome, but Gary and Eileen's son Todd does. Eileen has the recessive allele for RSL from her father David, but Gary also has a recessive allele for RSL to be passed on to Todd. And we also know that either Michael and Suzanne must be heterozygous for the allele to be passed to Gary and Marvin, but we aren't sure who exactly. So we know for sure that Marvin, Gary, and Eileen are the individuals that must be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome. Next up, we have worksheet questions continued. Question 2, which individuals might be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome? Suzanne, Michael, and Jackie are the individuals that might be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome, and this is because Jackie might be homozygous dominant or heterozygous for RSL due to David having 2 recessive alleles and Eileen not having restless leg syndrome. We also know that Michael or Suzanne could be heterozygous, but only one of them is required to be heterozygous. One of them may be hetero for the dominant allele, normal legs, or homozygous dominant. Worksheet questions continued. Question 3, which individuals must be heterozygous for the red melanin gene? The individual that is heterozygous for the red melanin gene is Eileen. Jackie could be heterozygous for the red melanin gene, but we can't be too sure about that. Todd has restless leg syndrome and red hair, so therefore we know that Eileen has to possess the heterozygous red melanin gene. Worksheet questions continued. Question 4, if Marvin marries a woman who has restless leg syndrome and red hair and cannot tan, what is the probability of the child having both traits? So the best way to do this is to do a Punnett square. So we know that Marvin has the dominant trait for normal legs, and they both have red hair, so the rest of the Punnett square will have the recessive trait for red hair or red melanin. So we end up with the phenotype 4 out of 4 with red hair and 2 out of 4 with restless leg syndrome. And the genotype is 2 out of 4 for the dominant traits, normal legs, but it'll be heterozygous, and for red hair, recessive, and 2 out of 4 for the recessive traits of restless leg syndrome and red melanin. So the possibility of having a child with red hair would be 100%, and the probability of the child having restless leg syndrome would be 50%. So the probability of the child having both traits would be 50%, and this is because Marvin and his wife are homozygous recessive for red melanin, but Marvin is hetero for restless leg syndrome, as I described. So class connection. In this case, we have families that have red hair, cannot tan, and deal with restless leg syndrome. So the law of segregation, or as we know, Mendel's first law, can relate to these traits. The law of segregation is, in gamete formation, the two alleles at a gene locus segregate from each other, and each gamete has an equal probability of containing either allele. For example, we know that Jackie and David both have brown hair, and they had their baby Eileen that had brown hair. Eileen actually possesses the brown hair trait and red hair trait because either her mom passed down the red hair trait and her dad passed down the dark hair trait, or it could be vice versa. Mom and dad have 2 traits for hair color, but the prodigy or baby will only get 1 trait from each other. So another important concept of this case is alleles. Alleles are one of 2 or more versions of a gene. There are dominant and recessive. For instance, in this case, we have normal legs that are represented as dominant in, and it is dominant because even if it has 1 copy of the allele, it will show its effect, and if the allele is recessive, it needs to have both copies of the allele to show its effect, such as Todd being both recessive in restless leg syndrome and in red hair. Lastly, we have Punnett squares and a single locus test cross. Punnett squares help determine ratios of genotypes and phenotypes. As we saw in Marvin's, the ratio for that would be 1:1. And the test cross helps when there is uncertainty of a genotype. For example, as we use the Punnett square to find the probability of Marvin and his wife's baby for having red hair and restless leg syndrome. Additional information. Here is some other interesting information of restless leg syndrome. Restless leg syndrome is also called Willis-Ekbom disease, and it is a neurological nervous disorder that causes the trouble to sleep due to an uneasy feeling in the legs, such as itching, pulling, throbbing, or aching. It is more common in women than in men, and it happens to about 10% of people. So to treat it without drugs, people take hot baths, they get leg massages, and they put heat or ice packs on their legs. Some medications that can be used to help treat it are Ropenrol and Pramexol because they send dopamine up to the brain. There are 3 loci that have vulnerability to RLS. They are located on chromosome Q, 12q, 14q, and 9q with an autosomal dominant mode of inheritance. They are now labeled as RSL1, RSL2, and RSL3. I attached a video. I'm not too sure why it's not popping up. It is a YouTube video that basically describes what restless leg syndrome is, how it's caused, and what can be done to help it. Additional information about red melanin. It is actually called pheomelanin, and it's when a person has red or blonde hair, freckles, and cannot tan. It is on the MC1R gene. It produces a protein called melanocortin-1 receptor, and it plays a role in pigmentation. So the MC1R polymorphisms reduce the ability of the melanocortin-1 receptor to make eumelanin, and that causes the melanocytes to make mostly pheomelanin. So pheomelanin, as we described, is red or blonde hair, freckles, and cannot tan, and eumelanin is when a person has darker colored traits, so darker skin, darker hair, and that is the case study. We have references here at the end for the pictures and the articles and the YouTube video that can be watched. Thank you.